So we can talk about the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, everything within those meninges, right, those layers, important for higher cognitive function. So we make a functional association, like memory, attention, language, etc. We can talk about the peripheral nervous system, right, which is the sensory neurons that are arrayed throughout the body, the motor neurons that allow you to affect change in motor systems, muscles throughout the body, and also ganglia that are responsible for, slightly more complex processing in terms of regulating heart rate or breathing rate or organ function, etc. These collections of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. And they're going to be involved with sensory, transmission of sensory information to the central nervous system, with sending motor output from the central nervous system to the body, right? These are the functional associations with the peripheral nervous system, and also changing heart rate and, affecting change in breathing and other organ system function, right? So all of these are associated with the structures of the peripheral nervous system. We can also talk about the nervous system being divided functionally, right? And then we can sort of see structural associations that are consistent. So it turns out we can talk about the autonomic nervous system. And the example that's probably very useful is to think if you're like on campus, right, and it's maybe dusk, and you're in a pretty good mood, etc., but all of a sudden you hear this sort of snap of a twig behind you, and you realize there's not too many people around you. And, you might find suddenly your heart is racing, and you might be perspiring, and you might be oriented. You might have turned your head, neck, and eyes to try to identify the source of that snap, right? This all happens automatically in response to that stimulus, right? It's response to that auditory stimulus. And so the areas of the nervous system that are engaged actually in carrying out that whole panoply of responses, which involve a lot of internal changes in heart rate and organs function and blood flow, and also large-scale sort of motor movements like orienting, right, to the source of the stimulus, are part of what we call the autonomic nervous system, right? And the part that I'm describing here, where your heart starts to race and your blood is shunted to your legs for flight and escape, this is part of what we call the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now, if you were to turn around, right, and you were to realize that this is a small kitten that has stepped on a twig or something, and you relax dramatically, and you will take the kitten home, and you will order a pizza, and you'll put your feet up, and you'll feel pretty relaxed. Well, in this case, your heart rate's going to slow. All these changes are going to occur in your body that allow you to conserve energy and relax. This actually represents the activation of another set of neuronal structures that are going to be involved in what we call the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And it turns out that these are functional divisions here. We're talking about sympathetic, right, fight or flight. We're talking about parasympathetic, conservation of energy, relaxation, etc. They're going to involve certain structural aspects that sort of serve to distinguish them as well. So it turns out we'll learn later, because sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the relationship between the levels of activation of these two systems is going to be influenced often by many types of drugs, including, for example, sympathomimetic drugs that we'll talk about later, like cocaine, for example, or methamphetamine, which can increase your heart rate and increase blood flow to the legs, and it'll be influencing this system. Turns out that the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is associated with a particular chemical, a particular neurotransmitter. This is a term that we'll talk about in more detail as the course progresses, but this is a chemical that's released by neurons that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system to affect their changes, the changes that are intended by activation of the system on the organs. So again, the neurotransmitter, it turns out norepinephrine, and this is one that we'll talk about in more detail, is released by the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system on the organs, in the body, to affect the changes that are associated with fight or flight. And it turns out that the parasympathetic system releases a different neurotransmitter on the organ systems to affect changes that are associated with parasympathetic activation, with conservation of energy and with relaxation. And that neurotransmitter is known as acetylcholine. And again, we will go into more detail on both of these neurotransmitters as the course progresses. But this is, again, an example of taking this time a functional distinction, sympathetic, right, nervous system, fight or flight, right, versus parasympathetic system, conservation of energy, relaxation, and identifying certain structural features that distinguish the two. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with norepinephrine release, and the parasympathetic system is associated with acetylcholine release. Now I also list down here, there's also, you can speak very broadly about the voluntary somatic nervous system. This somatic means body, right? So this is the nervous system involved in sort of direct, sort of conscious, intentional control over, movements, etc. And we can find, specific, structural features that distinguish this system and separated from the autonomic system as well. So this is just all an attempt to try to get you to think about how to approach a system that is as complex, as the human nervous system with 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synaptic connections. The two very useful ways are to go at it structurally, to separate off specific regions, and then identify what functions those areas are associated with. And the other way is to actually go at it functionally. Say what areas are going to be involved in this activation or this behavior, and then look at the structural features that identify that system. So there is a relationship between structure, the biology, and function, right, the psychology or the behavior.